You're watching CRE Radio and TV live. I'm your host, Howard Klein. Today we are discussing landlord concessions and are they worth it or are they right for you? During the show, we'll go into some depth explaining what landlord concessions are and how they may differ from country to country, state to state, and even from city to city. We'll also be discussing what are the considerations from both the landlord and tenant perspectives, and we'll also be discussing some of the lease provisions and strategies used when negotiating the lease. We'll be right back. Well, this is Howard again. Joining me today is my usual co-host and master of arms, Peter Morris, with the Greenstead Group in Vancouver, Canada. If you think he looks pretty now, you should see his picture from 30 years ago and wait till you hear his voice. Our special guest is Jerry Neitlich of In-House Corporate Real Estate in Orange County, California. Jerry is exclusively a tenant rep broker, and during the conversation, Jerry will be speaking from the perspective of the tenant. Peter will be speaking from the perspective of the landlord, and I will switch sides depending upon how the wind blows. I am currently a real estate advisor with SVN, the Equity Group in Las Vegas, Nevada. I have been a real estate broker on 3 separate occasions, twice in California, once in New York, and I have been a commercial real estate attorney for over 42 years now. Further information about each of us and how to get in touch with us will be included in the description and comments sections for this video. So now, let's get going. So right now I have Jerry on the screen, and now I'm going to switch, to all 3 of us. And the guys, unless you're watching Facebook, you wouldn't know what scenes I'm switching to, right? But I'm looking right now to the overlay, my lower third. The 2 of you are nice and big, and mine is so tiny that I can't even see it. So just call me tiny. Before I go any further, I just want to mention that we do have a special show coming up. I believe it's on the 28th of is that March, and I have Joyce Reitman, or is it Reitman? Sorry, Joyce Reitman with Reitman, who is the CEO of Motion Loft, and I had done an interview with Joyce a while back. That's a Mark Cuban company, by the way. And they're all about sensors. So we're going to be talking about sensors in real estate. And I'll let everybody know a little bit more about that. I noted with Jerry, although you weren't on the line at the time, Peter, that I think between the 3 of us, we have about 120 years worth of experience on this show right now.
That would be appropriate.
Yeah, it's about that.
98 of that was yours, Howard.
Yes,
you know that.
I know. I certainly look it. I can play Kris Kringle with my white beard right now. So, let me start out with saying what I believe concessions are, and then I'm going to ask Jerry, because before we got on the show, Jerry told me about an interesting story about negotiating a lease up in Canada, and then Peter can get involved in it. And I define a landlord concession of anything of value that a landlord will offer to incentivize the tenant to enter into the lease. These concessions can take, in the broadest perspective, these concessions can take many forms and generally can be considered anything of value to the tenant. Whatever it takes to get the tenant to sign on the line is what it is necessary. Typically, however, and we'll talk about depending upon where you are, leasing professionals consider landlord concessions to include free rent, construction and tenant improvements, options to renew, which is kind of a broader perspective, but include anything that the landlord, the tenant considers of value. Now, Jerry, we're going to get to you on this because you told me this interesting story that we have to sound like brokers and attorneys now because we have to add the word, well, it depends. Tell us the story where it was that you were negotiating a lease up in Canada.
Right. I was in Markham, Canada, many years ago, and Peter, you're going to have to fill me in if this was just a local custom or Canada-wide. But I was talking to the broker about building walls and putting in ceilings and whatever, and I was referring to him as TIs, and he's talking to me about parking, free parking and health club memberships. And I said, okay, Michael, I'll never forget his name, Michael Sheehan from CB at the time. And I said, Michael, what are you talking about? He said, well, you're talking about tenant inducements, TIs. And I said, no, I'm talking about building walls. What do you call, the other? And he said, those are leasehold improvements. LIs and not TIs. So wherever you are, you have to understand the local lingo. So we figured it out, and we got all the concessions that we both wanted. So Howard, to go back to you, this is it works once you understand what the other party is talking about.
Yeah, one of the problems that we have in the industry is that we use terms interchangeably. Mm-hmm. So leasehold improvements definitely used across Canada and the United States. TIs used as tenant inducements or tenant improvements used across Canada and the United States. TIAs being tenant improvement allowances generally is universally accepted. And I do want to comment, because I'm taking the side of the landlord here. Jerry's going to take the side of the tenant, but I want to comment on concessions. From the landlord's perspective, a concession is any wording that is opposite of the landlord's standard lease and the landlord paying anything out of his pocket. That's a concession.
I tend to agree with you on that, at least from the broadest perspective, because I was on a Financial Poise webinar earlier this week, and Biff Ruttenberg was on it. And for those of you who don't know, Biff is kind of an icon in the Midwest. One of the few people in the business now who's actually older than me. And he insisted that if he can avoid it, will never give a tenant, a build out. Never do it. Period. That happens to be his perspective. But, in some cases, you're going to have to give some things up depending upon, what the market is. I think that's really more like it. So, Jerry, why don't you tell us what you would consider to be items of value that the landlord would be giving up? A concession, so to speak.
Well, it's a pretty wide range, and Howard, I guess I want to preface it by saying when I work with a client, we look at their business situation and what they need in order to get into that building, and we look at it as a total band of value. So, for example, if the rent is in California, by the way, Southern California, we look at rents on a monthly basis. So I'll use like $2.50, $3 as numbers. So we look at the band of value, and then the big conflict is the landlord wants to get the highest rent. Okay, they want to get so for market value it shows, for financing it shows as a higher value. The tenant, of course, wants the lowest rent. So the compromise comes in with the concessions. So what if the landlord gets the face value X, then what concessions will still fit within their parameters of their pro forma? Okay, and Peter, jump in if I'm missing, because I've never been on the landlord side. I've only been on the tenant side.
You're 100% correct, Jerry. In fact, on the landlord side, we kind of look at it like this. We say this is the rent, and this is what you get. Now, if you want, this is at least my style, if you want a concession, if you want an improvement allowance, for an example, or free rent or something else, that impacts the rent. I call it open kimono negotiation, whereby I say this is the deal, but if you want this, then the rent's going to change to reflect that. And basically what we're doing is we're building it back into the deal. It's kind of like the used car salesman. They say, or the new car salesman, you can get this car with 0% financing. But if you want a lower price on the car, all of a sudden the financing cost comes in.
Yeah.
So it's a give and take. It's that band of value that you talk about. And what we do in the industry, either on the landlord side or Jerry, in your case, on the tenant side, is we try to come to a compromise between the two within a band of value that works for both people.
Right.
However, there's some hidden tips and tricks that I know we're going to be talking about today.
Well, why don't we talk a little? Why don't we talk a little bit about a typical rent or typical concession, which would be free rent, and some of the ways that it might be expressed in the lease. Peter, why don't you start out on that issue?
I think there's two types of free rent. One is free rent that is for the business once it's operating, and is intended to provide a cushion while there's a ramp up in sales. Now, as a landlord, what I try to do is I try to take that free rent, and rather than front load that free rent, I will spread it out over the course of the term because it's more beneficial to me in case the tenant goes away.
Let me ask
if the tenant goes away, I'm not out of pocket for that amount of money. And I'll explain some of the ways that I can get back to that money later.
Let me interrupt you for a second, because that raises a very important point. Because in your calculations when you're negotiating the lease, you're considering the whole idea is to translate everything into dollars and cents,
right,
including the present value of those things. But if you give free rent in the beginning of the lease, the landlord is taking on a certain risk.
Yes,
and there
landlord's
are ways
taking on a big risk.
Right, and you're pointing out the risk factor, and I don't know how you value it other than it depends upon the quality of the tenant that you have. What are your thoughts on that, Jerry?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to look at, I talked about market, and when we go into a building, there's typically, like, for example, here in Orange County, California, there are certain things you would expect. With a, let's say, a 3-year or a 5-year lease. The typical concession may be, like Peter said, certain amounts of free rent, whether it's up front, whether it's spread out. Personally, by the way, Peter, I like to spread it out, like first year, second year, third year. It's better for my tenant my client on a ongoing basis for their budgeting, so they understand where it's coming. But then you also figure the standard things would be X number of dollars of tenant improvements. Those are kind of the simple basic things, but then beyond that, there's other things we would look at. It could be anything from a moving allowance to...
Well, why don't we, Jerry, we still have more to talk about in terms of the free rent thing.
Because there's the second part to free rent, Howard, and that is the free rent during the fixturing period. Some landlords will say, no, the rent starts when you get possession of the premise. And I think personally that's unfair for the tenant. I don't do that. I understand a fixturing.
Peter, can I interject? Are you talking about a retail or an office, though? Because retail is different, where you do give the fixturization period.
Right. So I am talking retail, and I was going to touch on office later, where there's the landlord build out. Because when the tenant takes possession at that point in time, it's already built out. You just move in and away you go. But in retail, there's usually customized fixtures that the tenant is putting in, and so that fixturing period should be a free rent to the tenant. I consider that to be an inducement. Particularly if it's completely rent-free, that there is no additional rent charges for things such as common area maintenance, insurance, and taxes. So if I'm doing that, that's a concession, and I have to build that back into my rental structure over the balance of the term of the lease. Mm-hmm. And a little later on, I know, Howard, you want to touch on this, how do landlords get all that back to protect themselves, and what do tenants need to do to protect themselves?
Yeah. Let me add that my perspective, and it's because since I've been an attorney for so many years, I don't really care what the reason is. I just care that my client wants this or the other side wants this. So you can call it for fixtures, it'll call ramping up your business. Doesn't make any difference to me. To me, it's like dollars and cents, period. And I care about the things so that the parties understand. Now, if you're negotiating, and this is part of your 3 or your 5 whys or 25 whys, Peter, but if you're negotiating, there's a need to understand what the other side, why they're taking a position. But at the time that you are ready to put pen to paper, it doesn't make any difference. What makes a difference is perhaps whether or not you say the lease starts on January 1st, but rent commencement is not until July 1st, or you say that, the lease doesn't start till July 1st, and we're going to give you early possession. I mean, those are different ways of saying the same thing, but they also have ramifications. Peter,
Yeah, they do.
Yeah,
I mean, they do. For an example, in your first scenario, you said you get possession on January 1, rent starts July 1. So if the tenant opens on May 1, they're getting free rent. But if it's intended as a fixturing period, as a landlord, I put in a little wording that says will end at the earlier of the tenant opening or X date. And that protects me because now I know that, okay, we finished with the fixturing period. And if I have free rent beyond that, that's another story. But I'm not double dipping on the free rent. Now, from Jerry's perspective, he wants that fixed, I'm sure.
Well, I'll tell you what we run into. A lot of leases will say that the lease starts at such a date. We have the tenant improvements, and then you start that date. Just as a early occupancy, maybe you call that up there, Peter. We typically will put in the LOIs, the letter of intent, that we would get possession of the premises fixturized or completed, the tenant improvements, at least we try to get 15 days prior to. So this way we could go in, set up our furniture system, set up our computers, do all that kind of stuff. So when, let's say, January 1st comes along or February 1st, whatever the start date is, we're ready to go. And whether it be a free rent period or whatever, that's a separate negotiations. But we want to try and get into an office or an industrial space at least a week or two prior to the starting date. Now, here's another example. What happens if the TIs that the landlord is doing is delayed for 2 or 3 months? A situation I have right now.
Well, Jerry, you just want to get out of that free rent discussion. But actually, it's a good segue. Why don't we move into, since it's so inextricably entwined, there's often the discussion about early possession and tenant improvements as some of those major concessions. But before we get to that, Peter, from the landlord's perspective, why would the landlord give free rent or even do construction or offer a construction allowance? Now, that's like 3 different discussions right there.
Oh,
but
boy, is that ever.
Yeah, but absolutely.
That's a softball, Howard. I can work.
Well, it is a softball, and I can talk from the perspective of the tenant on this. When I was general counsel for Allied, we almost always, it was a weak real estate market, so we almost always had issues with who was going to do the tenant improvements. But Peter, why don't you answer the question, why would a landlord even offer this stuff?
Well, I think a landlord wants to offer it for a number of different reasons. I think first and foremost to be competitive in the marketplace, because you are going to have other landlords that are in a weaker position and will be wanting to fill up their building. There's a situation right now in New York City. Hudson Yards came on in New York, and it emptied a lot of buildings in the rest of New York. So consequently, they're in a very competitive situation. So they're saying, okay, I'll offer you these incentives in order to have you come into my property. The other thing, though, is you have to bear in mind, from at least the way that I deal with it as a landlord's representative, is to, I can't hear Howard. All of a sudden, he went away. But
No,
I
went away on purpose, and I muted my mic because we've got the cleaning people here, and the vacuum was going on. So I had to put myself on mute so that I could yell out at the top of my lungs, yes. You can't be vacuuming right now. So if I just did it, what was the whole purpose of me going on mute? Go ahead, Peter.
Well, at least I didn't have to hear you yell. So anyway, the other thing is, and again, it's the way that I deal with it, and Jerry alluded to it right off the top of the show. Whenever I give a concession, I build it back into the rent. Mm-hmm. And when I build it back into the rent, there is a beneficial result to me as a landlord. give you an example. If I just give away $1 in TI, and I built that back into the rent and got $1 back in increased rent, and I'm living in a world with a 5% capitalization rate, which is how we price commercial properties, either for financing or for selling. That $1 just translated into $20 worth of value on my property. So it's very beneficial for me to be able to do that. But the trick is, and this is the thing, landlords have to recapture anything that they give away as a concession. It's got to be done. And anybody who thinks that they're getting something free from the landlord, like a build out or something like that, they're dreaming. Because if you're dealing on the opposite side of the table from me when I'm representing a landlord, not only do I recapture that, I also get an interest rate on it. And I factor that back in. Yeah. So that's one of the big motivators for landlords to be able to do that. Yeah, aside from being competitive in the marketplace.
Well, just to say, tenants don't understand that, and that's part of the educational process I have to go with my clients. It's like matter. You can't create matter. You can change its shape and form, but it's still matter. Just like money, you could shape it a different way by adding more rent, by doing less rent, by doing other things. But again, real estate is, like Peter said, it's a market-driven item, area. So if the other landlords are all giving $20 in tenant improvement allowance dollars or giving 6 months free rent, you're kind of forced by the market. What we're going to get into, I think, is the other concessions that maybe one landlord will give but the other won't. Those are kind of the real key things that we look for, with our clients. What else can we get from the landlord that's not going to cost us any more money and probably won't even really cost the landlord a lot of money? And you got to figure out what's the benefit to both. That makes it work.
Jerry, now that you're finally into tenant improvements, now you want to get out of it? We're not finished. I don't get
I do want to jump in on Jerry's side here for a second.
Wait a second.
No, I'm not gonna move off the topic, but here is a benefit to the tenant of a tenant improvement allowance, even if it's built back into the rent. And that is that other than IFRS, meaning now that you have to capitalize your leases, but if you're a small operator like Jerry deals with, it's not a big problem for you because you can still use US GAAP. But what it amounts to is a loan that doesn't show up on your books. So it doesn't affect your financing when you go to the bank and get your financing. I mean, they're going to look at your rent, and hopefully you are profitable at that rent. But look at it as a separate issue. It's kind of like financing. And I'll touch more on what that means a little bit later for the landlord.
Wait, let me just jump in, Howard, because here's a market thing that's happening in our market right now. And Peter, I never heard it from the landlord standpoint, but that's always the way I believe. A lot of landlords now are giving a tenant improvement allowance, let's say of $10, but they're saying, okay, you could use up to X number of dollars for tenant for rent abatement if you don't use it for tenant improvement. So, example, they may get $4,000 out of $10,000 that they have to use, but then the other they could use for either tenant improvements or free rent. So you're right, Peter. It doesn't show up on their balance sheet. It shows up a different way. So I never heard it from the landlord standpoint, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, just as an aside, talking about...
I work on both sides.
Talking about that tenant improvement allowance, and I want to get to so that people understand the difference between the landlord doing the tenant improvements or giving a tenant improvement allowance, which is typically where the tenant's going to be doing the work. And we don't have the time today to go into all of the myriad issues. We could do another whole show or a couple of days shows on the things that you have to pay attention on that. But on the tenant improvement allowance, what do you typically see where the tenant has to use all or a portion of it? How did the leases or the landlords kind of control that in the language?
So as far as landlord's concerned?
No, I was asking Jerry. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say
Jerry.
Peter?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was directed Peter. Just give me a quick one. I thought Peter, that question was for Peter.
I'd say, Jerry, you are older than me and you just fell asleep on me. Okay. Now, so as an example, the landlord's giving $10,000 in rent concessions as tenant improvement allowance, and is saying you have to use the 4,000 of which you have to use on construction. How does the landlord control that $4,000?
Oh, okay. That's easy. I'm going through that right now with a couple of clients. We've got two clients, exactly same scenario. Basically, we have till a certain date in order to use our tenant improvement dollars for whatever, up to, I think in this case, it was 14,000 total, and we have to use 5 for tenant improvements. So we're going through carpet and paint on this is about $13,000. They can do less offices for 4,000 or 5,000. So what I've done is I've gone out and gotten proposals from 3 different vendors for my clients, and we're evaluating that right now. I keep the landlord in the loop so they know where we're spending our money. And one client decided that we're absolutely not going to use any of we're going to go to the max of the TI dollars that we have to use. The rest we're doing free rent. So we've already notified the landlord that for the next 2 months or so, we're going to use that portion. So we only have let's say 5,000 left that we could do something. And actually we don't need anything. It's interesting with this client because we're trying to figure out what we could spend the money on. So we keep the landlord in the loop.
Peter, what is your position? How do you control that $4,000 and how that is spent? Let's talk in terms of what the lease might provide.
Well, the lease would provide a number of different things. First and foremost, it would, from my perspective, I don't give out $1 to a tenant for construction unless I get a number of things. Number one, I want to see receipted invoices. That's right. The first thing I want to see. Number two, I want to, first and foremost, I'm going to see the plans. So I'm going to know what they're going to be doing in the premises. But then I want to see receipted invoices, meaning that it's been paid. I want to have a stat dec, which is a statutory declaration, meaning that there are no liens on the property. And I prefer to see waivers from all the subtenants as well, or the subcontractors as well. So that would be how I know that it's spent. The way that I structure it from a landlord's perspective is ideally what I would say, you're going to get up to, sake of argument, I'm talking retail here, $45 a square foot in tenant improvement allowance. And that's up to. So if you only spend X number of dollars, let's say you spend $35, not $45, I'm not out of pocket that $10. However, in some cases where the tenant is saying, I want a tenant improvement allowance and I want free rent, I'll say, look, here's the deal. You get $45 a square foot in tenant improvement allowance. Anything you don't use will convert to free rent.
And Peter, all those things you said, I agree 100%. And I advise my clients about that. You got to get the plans approved. You got to get this. You got to go. So, Peter, you nailed it on that one, definitely.
And that's all in the lease.
Yeah.
And I have about 6 items before I release the money, and I don't release all the money up front. I may give them a draw schedule depending upon how much money is in the TI, how much work is being done, right. But I will always withhold some past the statutory lien declaration date.
Sure. Which is something else we might be able to get to talk about. So let me give you an example of what I did in the 80s when I was general counsel for Allied Education. Actually, I was director of real estate also, and part of my responsibility was to travel around the country, find locations, negotiate the deal, and I was responsible for the build-out. And we had, I think, at the busiest point, we had about 90 locations, and they were constantly revolving, so to speak. But because the market was generally soft, we could demand build out. We could demand rent concessions. We could demand a lot of different things. But one of the things that I insisted on was if I was in a city that I wasn't familiar with, I wanted the landlord to do the tenant improvements. I didn't want to do them. I figured the landlord could do them cheaper than me. The landlord knows all the builders, that I didn't want to go out and try to find people to trust. So as a consequence, what we normally negotiated was a dollar figure that the landlord would apply to tenant improvements. And it was a construction allowance. And then anything over and above that, we would end up paying. So there were all kinds of issues and I had to rely upon a lot of different people in order that I can have a reliable number. So, Jerry, why don't you tell me how you would handle that type of situation? And then I'll tell you if you're wrong.
I feared you would, Howard. Well, I'll say that's a great question because number one, there's two types of tenant improvement allowances. There's where the landlord will give you an allowance, and the second thing is what we call turnkey, which is basically you give them the plan and you say, okay, this is the plan. We agree on it. Landlord prices it out, says, yeah, we could do this. And if there's anything else that's above that plan, it's out of our pocket. I'm doing that right now with a physical therapist. We added a few things. We're paying for it. So that's typically the way that works. Now, as far as who you use, Howard, I've stopped doing a lot of international and national stuff because there's so much business here in Orange County. But I would say 95% of the time, I use the landlord's architect and the landlord's contractor because they're going to go out and get 3 bids anyway because they don't want to spend the money, right, Peter? They want to make sure that they're price conscious. So and the architect knows the building, so they know all the ins and outs along with their engineer. So as long as we have, particularly turnkey, which is great, let them do it. If it's an allowance, then we do, we'll look at the prices and we'll do value engineering. That's a term you may have heard. I don't know if they use that in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We look at the prices and we say, okay, how about if we did this instead of this? It's going to be cheaper. So you work it out. But again, I think, Howard, what you said, the local guy, even on a local broker in a local area, I still prefer to use the landlord's people because, again, they're responsible for it now.
And I'm going to say something that will be on both sides of the coin here, both landlord and tenant side. For the landlord to build it out, it's sometimes advantageous because what they can do is the landlord will say, this is the cost of the build out to the tenant and build it back into the rent. Now, if they can do value engineering and come in below that cost, it's money in the pocket for the landlord.
Exactly.
So, that's beneficial for the landlord. On the tenant side, you want that converted to free rent because you're paying for it in the rent. So you want to convert that back into free rent. So you want to have wording on the tenant side that would say, hey, if you do come in under the budget, show me what it cost you to build this out, by the way, then I want to convert that into free rent. So it's the reverse of what we were talking about previously. And what I find is that some landlords are vehemently opposed to that and some landlords are fine. Now, bear in mind, I'm in an enviable position. I can wear both hats. So I can be on the landlord side or on the tenant side.
Jerry, why don't you explain to everybody what a work letter is?
Okay, once you determine what the allowances are and who's going to do the work, there is an amendment to the lease or addendum to the lease, I guess you would call it, that will specify how the work is going to be done, who's going to do it, what the time frame is, and what the possible costs of variables will be. For example, a work letter may say that if you have a change order, that means you change the initial scope of the work that was originally billed. Not only do you have to pay for the additional work, but you may have to pay a fee of 10, 15, 20%. I've seen even as high as 25%. So the work letter, Howard, I always say there's 3 negotiations. There's deal negotiations, there's lease negotiations, and there's work letter negotiations.
Oh, it's so true.
So there's a lot of things in those work letters that you really have to pay attention to. Again, especially, I'll give you a quick example. I know where I go, but I had a guy that I saved him about $650,000 just because of the work letter, because there were things in the work letter that were extra costs that the original broker he had on the deal ignored, and they also didn't have a plan that was concrete, that was firm. So they were making changes all over the place that would have cost them over almost $750,000. It was a 25,000 square foot office, so it adds up. So pay attention. 3 types of negotiations: deal point, lease negotiations, and work letters.
Yes, and I would say that in the 80s when I had to negotiate these, the lease was often the easiest thing to negotiate. The detail required for the work letter, in order that I was comfortable that we weren't going to spend any more money than what we had agreed to, and here's an important element, timing. The work letters provide an element of timing. Everybody's got to perform within a certain period of time, otherwise, it's going to cost somebody. And that's particularly true if the tenant is not paying rent until the landlord turns over the premises. When I'm traveling all over the country, I'm going, look, landlord, you're supposed to do all of the work. You're going to do, here's the detail. And the detail, I would always employ an architect. We had an architect on call all the time who would help draw up the plans and say, this is what it's going to cost you. Here are the hardware that goes onto the door. Are these going to be full height doors? Are they going to be hollow doors? You go into absolute incredible detail before you sign on the dotted line, because if you're talking about $500,000 worth of rent construction allowance, if you don't, it's going to be hell to pay. If you don't have the detail, and all of a sudden it's $1 million, and the landlord is going, okay, here's $1 million. No, that should have been included in the original drawings that we have all initialed and approved. And I, as the tenant, I'm not going to initial anything unless the architect has malpractice insurance and tells me and initials it first.
Yeah, and I've seen work letters presented to me as a landlord from a tenant that far exceed in numbers of pages the actual lease document. And don't ever do a build to suit for Walmart, is all I'm going to say. Because that is a really, really onerous document. One of the things, you bring up a sort of a war story, Howard. Let me go back to the 1980s. I was representing a landlord. This is a retail property. My landlord did not have any upfront dollars to pay a tenant improvement allowance to the tenant, nor did they want to offer any free rent. So it was a little bit of a hard case for me because we were trying to entice this tenant to come in. It was a tenant that we really wanted into the property. It was a tenant that was very well known locally, so it had a brand cachet, but they were not as sophisticated as, say, a Starbucks. And so they wanted some money to help them build out the premise. Here's how we got around the situation. What we said is, this is the rent, this is the additional rent. We can't offer those things, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a % rent credit on the first % rent due after you go through your break point, equal to the amount of the TI dollars that you want. Now, the supposition was that the tenant was going to go into percentage rent. So the tenant was taking a bit of a gamble, but the tenant did go for it. And that's how we bridged that immovable object of a tenant improvement allowance or free rent.
Well, let me throw some of the kind of, this happened to us with another therapist we work with, where the landlord didn't want to give tenant improvement dollars. So we did what you said, Peter. We did free rent for, I think, like 3 months worth of free rent, which was equal to what we would have gotten for TI dollars. But here was the issue. This is in an office situation. The landlord, that was typical of him. He did not want to do the TIs. He would give you dollars. Well, the problem was everyone else who had been in the suite for the last 15 years or the building, sometimes it wasn't to code, sometimes it, so there were all sorts of issues that came up. I mean, it was, they had not ever pulled a permit on this building. So it became a real nightmare, and it ended up costing my client more because we had a great contractor, but we had to do more stuff that we thought we would have done. So sometimes you open up that can of worms, but that's why I said landlord's contractor, landlord's architect, unless like you, Howard, you had multiple locations. Always good have an architect create a standard, and then the architect could do it. But if it's a single location, sometimes it is better, let the landlord, it's their building. Right, Peter? You want to take care of your building. So why would you want a tenant to come in, bring their own contractor, and they could, I hate to use the word, screw it up.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about when you come into the deal and you're looking at an inducement or a concession, but we also look at the back end of the deal as a landlord. We want office tenants to remove all of their wiring. For an example, because and retail tenants to remove their improvements because the next tenant coming in may not be appropriate. And I've told Howard this story once before of a build-to-suit. It was a pad, it was a retail, and it was built to the tenant's specifications. The tenant vacated the property, went down the street to a new location because that landlord enticed them into that, and they abandoned the property. Landlord went and released that pad property to another, it was a restaurant. And the day that that restaurant opened, which was a competitor to the original restaurant that was in that space, they got a cease and desist order from the original from the original tenant, stating that the improvements were under copyright and design and infringed on their intellectual property. And they demanded that the landlord and tenant demolish the building in order to rectify their infringement. So the tenant was rightly upset. The landlord called me in and we worked out a compromise where we just made some changes to the facade and the paint color and things of that nature, and we got around their IP issues. But have to be careful on the backside as well when you're doing that kind of work.
Yeah, that's an important issue, and I want to ask Jerry this because I've seen a change in negotiating strategies over the last 40 years. And does it? I mean, we're talking about what the these rent concessions and other concessions that the landlord is giving, and one of which we're talking about tenant improvements. How important to you, representing the tenant, how important is it that the tenant or landlord actually owns the tenant improvements, and what does that mean to the tenant at a later time?
That's a good question. Typically, the standard form, if there is a standard, that word usually is not in my dictionary, but in the standard look at it, the landlord builds the tenant improvements, let's say the walls, the lights, whatever it is, and then when the tenant leaves, they just leave. But what happens if you do additional improvements during the term? So by law in California, you have fixtures and you have personal property. The simple rule is if it could be removed from the wall without damage, then it's personal property. If it's going to be damaged, it has to stay. Simple rule. So what I usually try to
I'm going to interrupt you.
Okay.
Remember, you're talking to a lawyer here. It's
Okay.
a little bit more complicated than that. So, let's just stay away from the law.
Okay, we're simplifying. I'm not a lawyer, okay? We just hang out with too many. Okay, but what we try to do right in the lease is language where if we do tenant improvements, that the landlord, what I try to get is at the time we get approval, which, Peter, you have to get approval, and that goes back to that work letter, that the landlord has to say to us, okay, we'll approve it, but at the end of the term, you have to remove it, or at the end of the term, you have to leave it. Because sometimes you have a landlord who you build a big room or something for yourself that's personal for your use, and the landlord says, that's great, it's permanent, but I don't want it to stay there. And 2 weeks before you're ready to leave, they say, hey, now you got to demo it and spend $30,000. So we try to get language either tell us upon approval, minimum tell us 90 days before we're ready to move, but please don't tell us like a week before that we have to remove the improvement.
Yeah,
Back in the 1980s, the big bugbears for landlords were banks with concrete
Oh
vaults
my goodness! Yeah.
and movie theaters with inclined sloping floor.
Yeah.
So, the issue, there's a couple of issues when it comes to what stays, who owns what, and things of that nature. Number one, for both the landlord and the tenant, and I'm not an accountant, so, take what I'm about to say to your accountant, okay? But in both Canada and the United States, IRS and CRA in Canada, the Canadian Revenue Agency, state that if you are paid a tenant improvement allowance to a tenant, that tenant declares that as income in that year, okay? Now, again, I'm not an accountant. Take that to your accountant, but that's what I've been told and that's what I've read. Same within Canada. So the situation is if you're a tenant and you're getting a large tenant improvement allowance, let's say $150,000, that's going to be taxed and on top of your sales. It will be part of gross sales. So from the perspective of the tenant, you may want the landlord to own that. The landlord can depreciate that. The landlord, on the other hand, wants to also own the improvements because they can depreciate those improvements over their useful life.
Right.
The landlord also would like to obtain any improvements that would be beneficial to a subsequent tenant so that they don't have to give out the improvement allowance. So there's benefits to the landlord in owning some improvements and benefits to the tenant in having the landlord own some improvements. I was recently working on the tenant side, and I actually saw a tenant improvement allowance that came in, and the wording was very specific. It said, we are giving you this allowance in order to perform some of the landlord's work.
Huh.
And that dictated ownership. And it wasn't yours. It was the landlord's work. It was going to remain with the property. And I think that that was drafted by the accounting department, not by the legal department, specifically around taxation. And so we're starting to see some of this. And IFRS is causing some heartburn, I think, for a few people around allowances and concessions and free rent. And what does that actually mean? And is free rent taxable? That's a question I don't know.
Yeah, which points out a very important point in my attitude, is if you're negotiating a lease, either on behalf of a landlord or a tenant, you got to have a team. So we've established that you need an accountant, because the language that you put into the lease may make a huge difference over the term of the lease to either party. That's number one. You need a good broker to explain all of this and put the team together. You need an attorney to translate all of this into language that will be enforceable so that either party or both parties get what they think that they're getting. And you need an architect often, so that you know what you're doing, and an attorney is not likely to be competent on the other three issues, and vice versa.
Howard, let me throw in another one. You absolutely need a good insurance agent.
Oh yeah.
In fact, when I'm running through a situation right now that when I do a lease, the first thing when I get the draft lease is I take that section and I send it to the client. I say, I'm not even reading this. Send it to your insurance agent. Because I just ran into a situation where the standard AIR lease, which is probably the most used form in California, they just added a clause in their insurance thing about a subrogation agreement that I've never seen before.
Oh, really?
And it was subrogation of the workman's comp policy.
Uh-huh.
It's always been a subrogation of or additional insured of the general liability. But one of the major landlords here in the area has had that for years, and the AIR just included it. And the downside is it actually costs the tenant additional dollars to get this subrogation. So it's a negative.
That's interesting, because in the subrogation provisions that I'm familiar with, it would require subrogation of all of the insurance that the tenant is supposed to provide. And if the tenant is supposed to provide workers' comp insurance, then a general subrogation provision would or should be applicable. We're going to have to move on. Because we only have a few
Just make
minutes.
sure you have a good agent.
Yeah. Well, no, but I think absolutely. I mean, I was fortunate at the time that I was working with a national tenant, and I had these tools available to me so that I didn't make any decision unless I spoke to someone else. And having that assistance was invaluable, absolutely. So what are the landlord's concerns? So we're not going to be able to get to a lot of stuff, and I'll write more about it. But what are the landlord's concerns when the landlord is giving some of these monetary concessions, such as a construction allowance, whether the landlord's going to do it or the landlord's going to pay it, because sometimes the landlord, in order to pay it, the landlord has a relationship with its banker who's going to loan the landlord money based upon the value of the lease that's going in place. So what is the landlord going to be concerned about, and how do they protect themselves?
One of the ones we talked about was taxation, and that's a minor concern, but I think it's becoming a larger concern. The big one is the tenant going to perform over the term of the lease so that the landlord can get a recovery of its inducement? Remember, this This is a way to induce the tenant to not only enter the lease, but to perform the balance of the lease. So what the landlord is most concerned about, and if they're borrowing the money from the bank too, is whether or not they are going to be repaid the amount of the inducement that they've been offered. In other words, is the tenant going to perform? So what does the landlord put into the lease? Landlord puts into the lease recapture options. Now, in some cases, they're meaningless, depending upon where you are, what jurisdiction you're in, and what happens to the tenant. And what you have is security sitting behind the lease and behind the tenant. But you, as a landlord, want to be able to recapture. So if it's free rent, the tenant goes into default, I want to recapture any free rent that I've been providing them, either up to that point in time or over the balance of the term of the lease. If it's a tenant improvement allowance, I want to be able to recapture every single dollar of the tenant improvement allowance.
That's at a very minimum. That's at a very minimum.
Yeah, that's at a very minimum.
Jerry, let me switch to you now. Security deposits, and I'm sure Peter was about to get to security deposits before I so rudely cut him off. But the question I have is, there are various forms of security deposit. Now, the security deposit often, and when I negotiated a lease in Houston with Citibank in a terrible economy, we signed the biggest lease in Houston in that year. I think it was 1987. And they wanted, at a very minimum, enough guarantee or security to pay the tenant improvements, which were about $500,000 at the time. So I'm not going to tell you what we ended up doing, but why don't I find out, what are your thoughts and what are you generally willing to give up in order to satisfy the landlord?
Okay. Well, the first thing is, let's talk about the standard security deposit, which in our market is 110% more than the last month's rent. That's pretty normal. So then the next thing is, if the landlord is putting in a lot of money, or if it's a new tenant, they may vary and say, okay, we want 2 or 3 months worth of security deposit in order to protect ourselves because we're doing these tenant improvements. So if we get that kind of a clause, what we'll say is, okay, we'll pay you the 3-month security deposit, but at the end of year 1, we get a month of free rent because you have the security deposit. Now we get it back and we've performed. And then in year 3, that extra month besides the free rent or concession we would have gotten, now we pay that back. So the landlord is still whole. They still have their month 110%, and they've covered their costs. Now this is an out-of-pocket, write a check for. On the other hand, if you have something like the $500,000, or I had one client, the basic security deposit was like $90,000, so we did a letter of credit. And it cost us $3,000 or $4,000 a year, but we weren't out the cash flow of the $90,000 or $100,000.
Well,
so
that's not necessarily true, because if it's $500,000 of letter of credit, the bank is going to be holding on to that $500,000, and as the tenant, you're not going to be able to spend it.
You got the financing issue on that one.
Right. So what happens
affects
is
your balance sheet.
Right.
Yeah.
But also the money sits usually, and I know what we did when we did that in Houston, is the money sat in the highest interest bearing account that it can be.
Exactly.
And we were the ones making money
right.
on that money. And when you're talking about $500,000, it ended up being a substantial amount. What other reasons would a landlord want a letter of credit, Peter, other than cash?
Well, they want it because it ties the tenant. The tenant is tied to that particular property and tied to that lease. And I use letters of credit when I have a situation where my guarantee or co-covenantor, they're different, is not resident in the jurisdiction in which the property is. So particularly if they're completely offshore, because it's going to be very difficult to get a letter of credit from them. So I get a letter of credit relative to the value of the lease that I am anticipating that I could be at risk for, including the allowances and things of that nature. That's when I do letters of credit. Tenants, have this belief that the letter of credit does not impact their balance sheet. And it does, as Howard points out. It's sitting there as a bank. I had one client on the tenant side, and we worked out a situation where they didn't want to impact that. They had a very creative solution. They had a surety bond. So they took out a surety bond. It's basically an insurance policy, and it cost them very little. But if they had to pay out on the bond, it was all paid out. So that was a sneaky way of dealing with the problem. Not sneaky. It was a creative way.
Yeah. Let me tell you how we handled it in the Houston deal. Was that since Chase Bank was spending $500,000 for our TIs, we did a series of letters of credit.
Yeah.
That after we've paid X amount of rent, or after 1 year, one of the letters of credit would go away, and on and on and on.
Similar to my security deposit.
Right.
Yeah.
So it works well that way. But let me mention something else. From the landlord's perspective, the letter of credit is extremely important in the event of a tenant bankruptcy.
Yes.
Because often in many states, at least in California, you don't have to segregate the security deposit from the landlord's general funds. So if the tenant files bankruptcy, the landlord most likely is going to have to pay that security deposit back. In a letter of credit, it's not. The landlord still gets it in bankruptcy. And that may vary, I'm not sure, from state to state, but that's generally a concept of U.S. bankruptcy law.
It does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it also varies depending upon how that letter of credit is structured. Because if the primary creditor is the bank upon which the letter of credit is drawn upon, they can structure their letter of credit that they still attach to it first if they have priority interest.
All right. So there's a lot of stuff that we didn't get to, and I'd love to get to, gentlemen. We're at an hour. We're actually going to go over a little bit. So we're talking about landlord concessions. Are they worth it? Why don't we start with Jerry? Landlord concessions, are they worth it? And if there's any takeaway from this discussion, what would that be? The primary takeaway?
Yeah, as I said, I think that there's a lot of different types of landlord concessions, anything from TIs to parking to could be health club memberships or things like that. And whatever you could do to incentivize the tenant to come in is very helpful. We, representing the tenants, look at the total band of value. We talked about this right at the beginning. And what's the bottom line going to cost, out of pocket for the term of the lease? So whatever the concessions are, it all goes into the pot. You all figure out what the bottom line is. If the bottom line works for the landlord, great, because it's going to work for the tenant, great. Now you have a deal that you could work for. But there's a lot of concessions out there that probably we haven't even touched on. But those are the basics. The rent abatement, the tenant improvements. Parking is a big concession nowadays. Here in Orange County, there is very few buildings, high-rise, that you don't have to pay for parking, or you have to pay for parking. So what kind of concession? So anything you can do. By the way, let me just a quick side one. A lot of landlords here in California are creating different types of buildings, you want to say, and accommodations like health clubs within the building, outdoor facilities where people could gather. There's bocce courts. So there's all sorts of stuff landlords are trying to do to incentivize the tenants to come to their building. So that's very important thing to look at.
Peter.
I think Jerry hit the nail on the head in as much as landlords are in the business of selling. They're selling space and overtime. And so I think that concessions are worth it for the right tenant, for the right deal. Yeah. Just as a carte blanche to everybody, no. But in order to get the deal that makes sense for the landlord, the tenant that makes sense for the landlord, I've seen huge concessions in retail, just talk anchors, in order to get the other tenants to come in, or a very well-known brand name that will attract other tenants to come into that retail property. So are they worth it? Yes. Do they come with pitfalls? Definitely, on both sides of the equation. And they need to be negotiated expertly and carefully, with thought, and most importantly, experience, people who have been around the bend over 100 and how many years did you say, Howard? 120
years.
There you go. And have seen it all and done it all. So bottom line, for both the tenant and for the landlord, they're worth it. But there are things that you need to be aware of. And hopefully we get to do this again, because there are some other things that we should explore in this topic.
Yeah, and that's my takeaway. We just scraped the surface. This is really, I mean, the three of us could talk for days.
Yeah.
On all of this stuff.
Howard, you asked for my takeaway. My takeaway is this. If you don't know what you don't know, don't do it. Hire someone that knows what they're doing. So the key phrase that I tell people, either prospective clients of mine, or I do a lot of training, watch for those things you don't know, because they'll bite you every single time. And in this business, they're costly and they'll last for a very long time.
And that's my takeaway. After we have I recognize the fact that we barely scraped the surface. And that we could go on for multiple days just digging into these issues and how we would react. I mean, most people have no clue as to what's going on in our head. It's not that we're worried about it, but we recognize all of these things that trigger when we're negotiating a lease, trying to avoid hiring someone like me as an attorney after the fact. That's the last thing you want to do. And by the way, I'm not going to be doing that anymore. All right. I'm going to take all of that experience and I'm going to go, okay, guys, we're now going to do deals and we're going to try to avoid all the stuff that I had to deal with for 40 some odd years. I don't want to do that anymore. So get a really good professional and a team. Don't expect that your one broker knows it all, because you're right now, who's ever listening to this, there are three of us with lots and lots of experience, and all three of us are going to say, well, at least Peter and I are going to say, we don't know it all.
Well, I'll tell you, the nice thing is we've, as Howard said, 120 years worth of experience. Look, Jerry learned something from something I said. I learned something from Howard. I've learned something from what Jerry said. After all this experience, we don't know it all, as Howard said.
Actually, I think they did a study on that, and I forgot the names of the guys who did the study, but you could look it up. It was at Stanford, and the basic premise was you don't know what you don't know. So it has actually been scientifically proven as a study. So I'll remember the name.
Well, that makes sense. If you have enough experience and you're not a fool, you begin to realize that going, as I learn more, the world of knowledge that I don't know gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like, oh my gosh, I know so much that I don't know anything anymore.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I don't know if people are going to enjoy listening to this, but I've had a blast and I love doing this. Jerry, we've got to have you on a more regular basis.
It's my pleasure. I enjoyed this.
We'll be doing, and you're more than welcome to join us anytime, unless Peter doesn't really like you, which is possible. So I've got to do stuff. So I'm going to end this, and that's a wrap.